Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Torah portion is Kitisa. The Torah commands the priests to wash their hands and feet before conducting the temple service. The rabbis command hand washing upon waking, before prayer, before eating, and on multiple other opportunities. When I studied in the Yeshiva, I had a bowl and cup of water under my bed so that I could wash my hands before my feet even touch the floor. If you've been to an Orthodox wedding or a restroom in Israel, you've likely seen a washing cup with two handles. What's with all the washing, you say? I say, watch your mouth and wash your hands. This year, it's a second or third year round. You never know what we're gonna discuss.
It's a good topic.
We're gonna discuss
really
washing your hands, of all things. In Exodus 30:17, which is part of our parsha, it says, God spoke to Moses saying, make a laver of copper and a stand of copper for it for washing, l'rechitza, and place it between the tent of meeting and the altar, put water in it, and let Aaron and his sons wash their hands and feet in water drawn from it. When they enter the tent of meeting, they shall wash with water, that they may not die, or when they approach the altar to serve, to turn into smoke and offering for fire to God. They shall wash their hands and feet, that they may not die. It shall be a law for all time for them, for him and his offspring throughout the ages. So this is a real thing. This is this is a law, and many times we go to the prayer book. The first blessing that you make in the prayer book, the first blessing you make over a commandment every day is, blessed are you, O Lord God, asher kidishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al netilat yadayim. You wash your hands. Under the bed is something called nagelwasser. We're going to get into all of that. Before you
Do you know what the word nagel means?
Nagel means nail. I think we might get into that as well.
And that is correct. I think that's what nagel means.
And it doesn't mean nail like hitting the hammer with a nail. It means nail as in the end of your fingertip. So, there's a lot of washing going on. And we're even going to see that, I might have mentioned before that Jews are recognized as Sabbath observers. So I think in India, the word even that they call Jews are people that keep the Shabbat. But I think, and maybe it's an urban legend or whatever, people understand there's a lot of hand washing going on amongst us Jews. So we are going to try to dig down to the bottom of the well, so to speak, and get into all of the ins and outs of washing your hands. What do you think, Rabbi?
I love it. This is a great topic. Take it away.
So, first of all, Torah Tamima, which is a kind of it captures all of the nuances of the Talmud, says from this verse, washing of the hands to prayer is associated with prayer. So, as I said, the first blessing that you make in the Siddur is this blessing of washing your hands, and it comes from this verse. The rabbis felt very strongly about washing your hands. In the Talmud in Barakot 15a, it says, Rabbi Chia bar Abba said, Rabbi Yochanan said, anyone who goes to the bathroom, washes his hands, puts on his tefillin, recites the Shema, and prays, the verse ascribes credit to him as if he built an altar and offered a sacrifice upon it, as it is written, I will wash in purity my hands, and I will encircle the altar of the Lord. So clearly there is a connection that the rabbis take to our verse and washing of the hands. And if prayer duplicated, if prayer was put in place of the temple service, here you have the Talmud saying it. And we see that right from the beginning. It says, Rabbi said to him, "Do not maintain, master, that one who does so, it is as if he immersed his entire body. As it is written, I will wash in purity. And it's not written, I will wash my hands." So we're going to see already from the beginning. And I was tempted to use this episode to talk about mikvah, which is something that you are intimately involved with because you do so many conversions. But the truth is there's a little bit of a tension between washing the hands and immersing in the mikveh. And that is mentioned right here. And it's almost like a mikdash katan, that washing your hands is somehow different than immersing oneself in the mikveh. But nonetheless, as we just saw, it's as if one has immersed themselves in the mikveh. It's as if one is reborn and rejuvenating. Ravina said to Rava, "My master, look at this Torah scholar who came from Israel," and said something astonishing. "One who has no water with which to wash his hands, he wipes his hand with earth or a rock." And it says, why? Because I will wash with water in purity, as it is written. So it's almost as though this washing is clearly washing, but it's also a metaphor for holiness. Do you feel that washing hands is, number one, associated with Jews, identified with Jews? Is it a critical part of rabbinic Judaism?
Well, first of all, let me tell you how it's associated with Jews. In the 1300s, there was a terrible plague in Europe. And the Jews, like a third of all European population was killed. And Jews were killed at a smaller rate than that. And there was a theory that it's because Jews keep the laws of cleanliness better than everybody else, that they're washing their hands all the time. So I want to tell you, and that led to anti-Semitism, of course, because they didn't like that. But it's interesting that even in that context, Jews are associated with washing your hands. I'm going to tell you an interesting law. The law is that you're not allowed to wash your hands ritually unless your hands are clean. That's a very interesting law. It means you can't wash your hands for bread if your hands are dirty. If your hands are dirty, you have to go to the sink, you have to wash your hands with soap, get them clean, then you can wash your hands for bread. So washing for bread, or washing in the morning, what we call Nagelwasser, is a ritual. It's not for cleanliness, which I think is very interesting.
So you almost said something, you're self-contradictory. On the one hand, you gave the hygienic argument for...
Right. I told you the way they look at it. The world looks at it as hygienic. But I'm saying that in halacha, it's exactly the opposite, which is interesting. That would be our answer to them. Right.
So as all of you faithful Madlik listeners know, we have Sephira on notes that go with every episode. And if you look into the notes for this week's episode, we quote an article from the Jewish Review of Books published in 2021, and it says Jews, Genes, and the Black Death. It's towards the end of the notes. And it talks about, for lack of a better word, I'm going to say this, Bubba Meisa, that every good Jewish mother would tell their kids, wash your hands because this saved us from the bubonic plague. And what's fascinating about it, as you say, Rabbi, is we're not sure that it came from the Jews or it came from the non-Jews. We do know that there was anti-Semitic outbursts during the plague because the Jews were blamed. That's just a reflex, I assume. But it's fascinating. The article goes into it and actually goes through the numbers, and it comes out, if you're interested, in saying that if, and that's a big if, the Jews did not die in the same numbers as the non-Jews, it may have something to do with DNA, and I just suggest that you read the article because we are not a DNA podcast here. But in any case, it is fascinating that nonetheless, what you're saying emanates this concept that washing hands was clearly identified with the Jews. It was a mark, so to speak. In the Gemara in Chulin 106a, it says, when Rav Dimi came to Eretz Yisrael, he said, due to the failure to wash with the first waters, meaning the washing that you do before you eat, they ultimately fed a Jew pig meat. So what happened? A Jew shows up to a butcher shop that carries both kosher meat and pig meat. And based on the fact that the guy didn't wash his hands, the proprietor figured he must not be Jewish. So again, what the Talmud is in effect saying between the lines is that washing of hands was an identifier. And I think that is kind of fascinating.
That is fascinating. I mean, then that's your point that you're making. It's that it's an identifier. And that's interesting socially. I'm interested in how we identify one another. Like, it seems to be that people are always washing their hands. Not everybody does this, and I'll admit that I don't do this either. But actually, the tradition is to wash your hands before you daven as well. Before every prayer service, you're supposed to wash your hands. That's why sometimes outside of a shul, you'll see a basin, a sink, in order to be able to wash your hands.
Well, absolutely. And I said that a little bit in the intro. These strange cups that have two handles on them.
Right, that's correct. Yeah, that's
you go to an Orthodox wedding and you see them. You go to a synagogue, you see them. If you're in Israel and you go to a restaurant, 9 times out of 10 outside of the bathroom, and they might even have the sink outside of the bathroom, it's made for ritual washing, whether it's washing because you've relieved yourself or washing because you're about to partake of a meal and eat bread. I mean, let me give you a sense of how many washing opportunities there are. We know when we go to a cemetery, we wash our hands upon leaving. After cutting one's hair or nails, and we'll get a little bit into the nails association here because you already mentioned that the water that one keeps at the side of one's bed, called Nagelwasser, that one washes one's fingertips upon waking up, has in the Yiddish, Nagel means nails. So you're washing your fingertips. Some people wash before prayer, and again, this reminded me of my yeshiva days when we did wash before prayers. I had forgotten about that, but it is kind of fascinating. Now, to see how important it was to the rabbis, go to Sota 4b. The Gemara continues its discussion. Rabbi Eliezer says, anyone who treats the ritual of washing hands with contempt is uprooted from the world. Mizalzel b'netilat yadayim. The rabbis took this very seriously. Rav Chia Bar Ashi says that Rav says, with regard to the first water, so let's stop here for a second. Before you start a meal, before you eat, there's Mayim Rishonim, and then that's what we all know, where you wash your hands before you say Hamotzi. But there's also Mayim Achronim, which you wash at the end of the meal. You may have seen these little wonderful Judaica pieces that look like a well with a little cup hanging down.
They're fantastic, aren't they?
They are. And that is Mayim Achronim, and that is to wipe off what it's called the Melech Sdomit, the salt from Sodom. And again, the health explanation would be that in those days they used a lot of salt to preserve things like
something
meat.
else. They didn't have cutlery. So the salt got on your fingers. Today you would say, what do you mean wash your hands at the end of the meal? You're using a fork and a spoon and a knife. But they didn't have cutlery. So the salt from the food, and they needed salt in the food because they didn't have refrigeration. So the only way they preserved the food was by salting the food.
So, and of course, there are more theological answers, because who can talk about Sodom without thinking about Midat Sodom,
Right, that's
the way
correct.
the
Why they
Sodomites
call it
were.
that.
So when you
good.
finished eating and you're satiated, which is the time that you might not focus on people that are less fortunate, wash off the salt of Sodom.
Good.
Is a beautiful
Very
explanation
good. Very,
I once
very
heard.
good.
Getting back to the Talmud, it says, so when you do the first washing, you must raise your hand upward. Sheyigbia yadav lamala. And when you do the mayim achronim, you put your hands downward. There is something, and we've already touched upon it, this association between holiness and cleanliness, holiness and cleaning one's hands. And so while you definitely have a point when you say this is not just cleaning one's hands, your hands actually have to be clean before this ritual washing, there is this sense of raising your hands to a higher level, raising you to a higher level. We have Mishnayot that talks about people being excommunicated because they questioned the laws of purifying the hands. This actually was a very big deal, and it was a controversial idea. I think I could say that it not only was an identifier of Jews, but because we Jews are the heirs of the Pharisees, the Purushim, the Rabbinic Judaism, in its day when there were other sects, it was a identifier of someone who was loyal to the rabbis. And therefore, if one did not wash or ascribe to washing, or one put down washing, one was kofer be'ikar, one was somehow undermining the whole edifice.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that is good. And that's, it's interesting. I wasn't thinking about Mayim Achronim, but that's another good example of kind of the balance between the hygiene piece of it and the ritual piece of it. You don't wait to wash until after Birkat HaMazon. You wash before grace after meals, because it's part of the ritual.
So what I love about scholarship today, and many times I will quote a la comparative religion from the New Testament, from the Quran, but in this case, it actually helps us understand the Talmud, because clearly the Talmud is excommunicating people who don't wash. It is judging people as to identity if they don't wash. Something was going on. And if it was just in a vacuum, we would say maybe it's a paper tiger. But in Mark 7, we have this long story, which I'm going to read. It says, the Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews did not eat unless they gave their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they came from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. I don't know if that's referring to being tovel, the kalim in a mikveh. Who knows? So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" He replied, and you're going to remember this from last week, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules." You have let go of commands of God and are holding to human traditions. And then it goes on and it compares it to honoring your mother and father. And to cut a long story short, because I welcome you all to read it in the original, and it appears twice in the New Testament, it's also in Matthew 15, they basically make the argument that while the Bible itself says that you have to honor your mother and father, the rabbis say if you make an oath, if you make a neder that you won't do something that involves your parents, you have to keep the oath. The argument that Jesus and the New Testament are making here is that this law of washing that we just read about in the Torah that relates only to the priests in the temple is only by rabbinic decree made for everybody else. And what they're undermining is rabbinic scholarship. They are undermining the oral tradition. They are fundamentalists in a sense. But the fact that they pick this particular law twice as their a case of argument is kind of fascinating. And of course, at the end, it ends up with something that I had always associated with Jesus saying about kosher. But he in fact says it about washing your hands, and he makes the famous comment, it's not important what goes into your mouth, it's what comes out of it. And what he meant to say, following up on the Isaiah quote, is that this purity needs to come from inside and not from outside. I call it a cheap punch, if you will. But it's fascinating to me that this was documented not only in the Talmud but also in the New Testament, that this was a point of discussion of separation between the sects.
Yeah, that is I mean, that's so interesting that this, they argued about this ritual. And of course, they argued about this ritual because this ritual is not biblical, but it was something that was added by the rabbis. So the Pharisees liked it because they were part of the rabbinic tradition. The other sects rejected it because they didn't have such a good feeling about the rabbis, right? So you're really introducing, even though you had this, the story about the sects, you're really introducing the fact that as important as ritual washing is, it's actually a rabbinic obligation, not a biblical obligation.
So I think you're right, and I think in the normal course of events, we would talk about this just as that. We would say that if the story that we read about in the Parsha is, call it an asmachta, that it's kind of like a metaphor or it's a prototype. But I think a little bit because it was so controversial, if you go to Tana Devei Eliyahu Rabbah, it says that yesh mikra ve'ein bo mishnah, that there are instances in the Torah of stories without an explanation or without the learning. And they actually bring, they talk about the Jews outside of Sinai where they had to clean themselves for 3 days. They had to go into the mikvah. And it says, V'gam lamadnu rechitzat yadayim min haTorah. The rabbis are trying very hard. This is so important to them that they are trying very hard to associate it. And of course, they bring our verse as well. And they say that because it says you shall be holy when you wash your hands, it doesn't relate totally or exclusively to the Kohanim, but also to all of Klal Yisrael. So it is kind of fascinating. I think the real elephant in the room here is that the rabbis introduced a whole culture of food that was either chulin or it was holy, and there were all sorts of degradations, and you had to be in a state of purity to eat them. And I think what's fascinating at the end of the day is what the rabbis have done is they've actually made an innovation here. If you look at Maimonides makes a general rule, and he says says whenever it comes to cleaning oneself, purifying oneself, even if it says something with regard to just cleaning one's hand, it is tefillah. It is total immersion into the mikveh. And in a sense, what the rabbis have done, because it would not be practical to go to the mikveh every time one ate, is they actually made an innovation that was a practicality. They said that dipping your hands, or we'll get into a second, washing your hands was enough to make you holy. I think that's a kind of fascinating kind of a tweak on what is at stake here.
I think that's great. I think that that's absolutely right. And what you said about the rabbis working hard to find the biblical source is kind of it's a familiar trope in rabbinics, that they look for a verse to support something that they made up themselves, because they want to make it stronger than just rabbinic. They want to give it the sense as if it's biblical.
Yeah, absolutely. But this was the stakes were a little bit higher here, because I think there's this whole issue of what constituted an am haaretz, and this whole question of eating damai. It was really a major identifier of who you were in terms of the holiness, the separation of the Pharisees. So let's get a little bit into, since our verse is universally taken as the hook upon which this is hung, let's go to our good buddy, the Sefer HaChinuch, who talks about every commandment. He had to include this because it literally says, you are commanded from now and forever. So he says the roots of the commandment is the fixed foundation that we have said to aggrandize the glory of the temple and all the activities that are done there. So there's a little bit of a sense of another tradition where this can't be about purity, because the only way one can get pure is by immersing in the mikveh. So what is this? And the track that many of these commentaries take is, it's giving honor. It's what you would do. It appears from all this that the intention of washing at the beginning is only for the aggrandizement of the glory of the temple. So there's a sense of, this isn't about necessarily purifying you, but it's about uplifting the moment and uplifting you to the thing. And this is where we get into raising the hands and the way that we wash our hands. He goes on to say, and that they do not put their hands into the water, but we pour it over their hands. And this is also the way of honor. He doesn't say necessarily who pours the water. We're going to talk a little bit, if we have time, about the whole sense of the honor of pouring water on somebody else's hands or somebody else's feet. But clearly, the way that we have our cup with the two handles, you can't put your fingers under the faucet. You have to pour the water onto it. And everybody talks about the blessing that we say, al netilat yadayim, which has a sense of raising up one's hands. There is this sense of elevation here.
Yeah, that's good. That's very, very good. The word netilah is, idea of raising your hands. Some people have the custom, if you watch people on Friday night wash their hands, some people wash their hands and they pick their hands up a little bit. They actually recite a verse, Se'u Yedechem, that you should raise your hands. There is this idea that you're elevated. The washing is a ritual that elevates you. There's a lot to be said there.
Elevate, raise your hands before performing something sacred. That is clearly a part of it. And so if we go on a little bit further, and we're not going to have time for everything, this whole washing of the feet is something that was lost. The rabbis didn't do quite the job on the washing of the feet that they did with washing of the hands. The truth is that Christianity took that, and maybe it was one of those instances where in a divorce we divide things up, and it was so associated with Christianity, and maybe even Islam, that we stopped doing it. In the story of Abraham, if you recall, when the angels came to visit him, the first thing that he did was he went out and he washed their feet. He said in Genesis 18, "Let a little water be brought, bathe your feet, and recline under the tree." In the Talmud, it says in Baba Metzia, he says, "Rabbi Yanai, son of Rabbi Yishmael, said that the guest said to Abraham, 'Are you suspicious that we are Arabs who bow to the dust of their feet?' Yishmael has already issued from them." So first of all, it's fascinating that the rabbi is Rabbi Yishmael, and he's talking about the children of Yishmael. But clearly the rabbis, Talmud is too early to talk about Islam, but already associated washing of one's feet as not something that elevated, but either one's feet were dirty or because maybe one worshipped the ground. In the source sheet, I have a lot of sources for where Christianity took this. I did find something fascinating in terms of the Reform movement have something called Brit Rechitza. For those Jews that have a problem with Brit Milah, they have taken this where they do a little ceremony where they wash the feet. To me, it sounds very Christian, but again, that's because we are so remote from this sense of washing. It's just so fascinating. What I would like to leave everybody with is this sense. We've talked about bracha in the past coming from the word berech, which is knee. But bracha also comes from the same word as berecha, which is pool. And in the notes, I quote the Malbim and others who really talk about this sense of a blessing being something that is poured from God to man and back and forth. He talks, and some of the commentaries that I bring talk about when a patriarch like Isaac divides up the blessing. He's scooping out the portion of the cup that belongs to each one. It's a beautiful, I think, image when we say a bracha and when we give a bracha, this sense of pouring the water. And I'd love to leave you with that image as we think about washing our hands.
That's great. This was a great topic. Thank you, Geoffrey. Shabbat shalom to everybody. Enjoy your weekend. Enjoy your week. We look forward to seeing you next week. Shabbat shalom.
Hey, Lauren, how's it going?
This is a really interesting topic. It came to mind this week, and I was doing some reading about the Parsha, and it talked about the Kohen Gadol, that the requirement was to wash their hands and their feet. And it wasn't necessarily that the hands were more important or less important than the feet. It was a ritual that included both. And I was wondering whether or not, now you've touched on it in your text here, but in going into the Holy of Holies, why do you think they also included the feet in that?
So actually, in the very verse that we started with, which was not for the Kohen Gadol, it was for the standard priest, it says in Exodus 30:21, "They shall wash their hands and feet that they may not die." And the classic commentaries all say that this had to be done. They even provide provisions for how it's done. One places one's hand over one's foot. Let's say your left hand on your left foot, you wash that, and you do the same for the right. So washing the feet is something that's kind of fascinating, and I kind of hinted at that got lost between the cracks in rabbinic literature, culture, and kind of reimagining Judaism after the temple. It survived very much in Christianity, and obviously it survived in Islam. But somehow it's preserved here, and most Jews would say that at the time of the temple, we'll be washing hands and feet again, but it didn't translate into any of the rituals that the rabbis created and that we follow today. I will say, even the sense of taking off one's shoes because you are on holy ground, Islam picked that up. Judaism, for the most part, not, although there are some amazing synagogues in the Caribbean who do not have wooden or stone floors. I think it's called Caresas. I forget the name off the top of my head. It's sand. It's made of sand. And I assume in those synagogues, maybe they did pray without shoes. In Judaism, taking off one's shoe is a sign of mourning or ultra hyper holiness. We do that on Yom Kippur. But again, I think you make a good point. What happened to washing the feet?
The distinction that you made this evening between purity and holiness was very, very interesting to me, that there was, that the holiness was in honor of, I guess, what you're suggesting of God. Purity was a way of being able to prepare yourself to participate in that. Is that the distinction?
So the Pharisees, which were quoted in the New Testament tonight, the Hebrew for Pharisee is perushim, means to be separate. They would say kadoshim tihiyu, perushim tihiyu. You want to be holy, you have to separate yourself. And part and parcel, we always think of the Pharisees as the people that said an eye for an eye, lex talionis. It's monetary. We saw them as very practical and taking Judaism along the path of evolving. But a very strong part of the Pharisees were these holiness laws. They distinguish between different types of food. You have a little bit of that in the Seder. One of the 4 questions is, every other night we wash once, tonight we wash twice. They kind of captured a temple rite of washing one's hands before one even ate fruit that might have had moisture on it and therefore could accept a certain level of unholiness. They were not like the Essenes. They didn't go into the desert and segregate themselves, but they're clearly what they tried to do was to pack and ship some of the rules of the temple into ordinary life. And they were known for that. And the term Am Haaretz, which nowadays we call, is a word we use for an ignoramus, in the Talmudic times, academics have shown that it actually had to do with the people who stayed in the land of Israel when many of the Jews went into Babylonia, and it was in Babylonia, in the Babylonian Talmud, where many of these laws were made about purity in terms of eating and washing. They came back, and the Am Haaretz was not willing to accept these rules. It was a major point of division. And I think that's part of why the washing part and the holiness part was monopolized and hijacked by the rabbis. And there you see this other trend in it, this sense of not holiness in the sense of impurity, but holiness in the sense of elevating and giving grandeur to the temple, giving grandeur to God, being reborn. But I do think, and I'll stop here, I do think what the rabbis did by letting you wash your hands is they created a fast food version of the holiness code. Whereas all of the commentaries say, if you look at the Bible, the only way you can purify yourself is taking a dip, going into the mikvah. The rabbis had to be more practical, and they permitted you to just wash your hands. So it was actually a practical innovation as much as anything else.
That's fascinating. I think the rabbi was right. This is a great topic, and the issue of cleanliness versus holiness. I do so many things during the day where I wash my hands for one reason or another, and it's interesting to trace back where that may have come from. So thank you for a very interesting session.
Thank you. And I'll only end with one language text. The rabbis say when you wake up in the morning and otherwise before you pray, you have to wash your hands because your hands are busy. You never know where they'll be. And I love that expression. So anyway, let's all stay busy. Let's all stay clean and holy. And we'll see you all next week.